and Quiet Flows the Don by Mikhail Sholokhov, translated from the Russian by Stephen Gary. This book consists of 512 pages. It is divided into 4 parts, subdivided into varying numbers of chapters. Not with the plow is our dear glorious earth furrowed. Our earth is furrowed with the hoofs of horses, and our dear glorious earth is sown with the heads of Cossacks. Our gentle Don is adorned with youthful widows. Our gentle father Don is blossomed with orphans. The waves of the gentle Don are rich with fathers' and mothers' tears. O thou, our father, gentle Don, O why dost thou, gentle Don, flow so troubledly? Ah, how should I, the gentle Don, not flow troubledly? From my depths, the depths of the dawn, the cold springs beat. Amid me, the gentle dawn, the white fish leap. Old Cossack Songs. Part 1. Peace. Chapter 1. The Melyakov farm was right at the end of Tatarsk village. The gate of the cattle yard opened northward towards the Don. A steep 60-foot slope between chalky, grass-grown banks, and there was the shore. A pearly drift of mussel shells, a gray, broken edging of shingle, and then the steely blue rippling surface of the Don, seething beneath the wind. To the east, beyond the willow-wattle fence of the threshing floor, was the hetman's highway, grayish wormwood scrub, vivid brown hoof-trodden knotgrass, a shrine standing at the fork of the road, and then the steppe, enveloped in a shifting mirage. To the south, a chalky range of hills. On the west, the street crossing the square and running toward the Lees. The Cossack Prokofy Melyakov returned to the village during the last war with Turkey. He brought back a wife, a little woman wrapped from head to foot in a shawl. She kept her face covered and rarely revealed her yearning eyes. The silken shawl was redolent of strange, aromatic perfumes. Its rainbow-hued patterns aroused the jealousy of the peasant women. The captive Turkish woman did not get on well with Prokofy's relations, and ere long old Melyakov gave his son his portion. The old man never got over the disgrace of the separation, and all his life he refused to set foot inside his son's hut. Prokofy speedily made shift for himself. Carpenters built him a hut. He himself fenced in the cattle yard, and in the early autumn he took his bowed foreign wife to her new home. He walked with her through the village, behind the cart laden with their worldly goods. Everybody from the oldest to the youngest rushed into the street. The Cossacks laughed discreetly into their beards. The women passed vociferous remarks to one another. A swarm of unwashed Cossack lads called after Prokofy, but with overcoat unbuttoned he walked slowly along as though over new-plowed furrows, squeezing his wife's fragile wrist in his own enormous, swarthy palm, defiantly baring his lint-white, unkempt head. Only the wens below his cheekbones swelled and quivered, and the sweat stood out between his stony brows. Thenceforth he went but rarely into the village, and was never to be seen even at the market. He lived a secluded life in his solitary hut by the Don. Strange stories began to be told of him in the village. The boys who pastured the calves beyond the meadow road declared that of an evening as the light was dying, they had seen Prokofy carrying his wife in his arms as far as the Tartar mound. He would seat her with her back to an ancient weather-beaten porous rock on the crest of the mound. He would sit down at her side, and they would gaze fixedly across the steppe. They would gaze until the sunset had faded, and then Prokofy would wrap his wife in his coat and carry her back home. The village was lost in conjecture, seeking an explanation for such astonishing behavior. The women gossiped so much that they had no time to hunt for their fleas. Rumor was rife about Prokofy's wife also. Some declared that she was of entrancing beauty. Others maintained the contrary. The matter was set at rest when one of the most venturesome of the women, the soldier's wife, Maura, ran along to Prokofy on the pretext of getting some leaven. Prokofy crawled into the cellar for the leaven, and Maura had time to notice that Prokofy's Turkish conquest was a perfect fright. A few minutes later, Maura, her face flushed and her kerchief awry, was entertaining a crowd of women in a by-lane. And what could he have seen in her, my dears? If she'd only been a woman now. But she's got no bottom or belly. It's a disgrace. We've got better-looking girls going begging for a husband. You could cut through her waist. She's just like a wasp. Little eyes, black and strong. She flashes with them like Satan, God forgive me. She must be near her time, God's truth. Near her time? The women marveled. I'm no babe. I've reared 3 myself. But what's her face like? Her face? Yellow, unhappy eyes. It's no easy life for a woman in a strange land. And what is more, women, she wears Prokofy's trousers. No, the women drew their breath in abrupt alarm. I saw them myself. She wears trousers, only without stripes. It must be his everyday trousers she has. She wears a long shift, and below it you can see the trousers, stuffed into socks. When I saw them, my blood ran cold. The whisper went round the village that Prokofy's wife was a witch. Astachov's daughter-in-law, the Astachovs live in a hut next to Prokofy's, swore that on the 2nd day of Trinity, before dawn, she saw Prokofy's wife, straight-haired and barefoot, milking the Astachov's cow. From that day the cow's udder withered to the size of a child's fist. She gave no more milk and died soon after. That year there was unusual mortality among the cattle. By the shallows of the Don, the carcasses of cows and young bulls littered the sandy shore every day. Then the horses were affected. The droves grazing on the village pasture lands melted away, and through the lanes and streets of the village crept an evil rumor. The Cossacks held a village meeting and went to Prokofy. He came out onto the steps of his hut and bowed. "What good does your visit bring, worthy elders?" he asked. Dumbly silent, the crowd drew nearer to the steps. One drunken old man was the first to cry, "Drag your witch out here. We're going to try her." Prokofy flung himself back into the hut, but they caught him in the porch. A sturdy Cossack, nicknamed Lushnia, knocked Prokofy's head against the wall and exhorted him, "Don't make a sound, not a sound. You're all right. We shan't touch you, but we're going to trample your wife into the ground. Better to destroy her than have all the village die for want of cattle. But don't you make a sound, or I'll smash your head against the wall." "Drag the bitch into the yard," came a roar from the steps. A regimental comrade of Prokofy's wound the Turkish woman's hair around one hand, pressed his other hand over her screaming mouth, dragged her at a run through the porch, and flung her beneath the feet of the crowd. A thin shriek rose above the howl of voices. Prokofy sent 6 Cossacks flying, burst into the hut, and snatched a saber from the wall. Jostling against one another, the Cossacks rushed out of the porch. Swinging the gleaming, whistling saber around his head, Prokofy ran down the steps. The crowd shuddered and scattered over the yard. Lushnia was heavy of gait, and by the threshing floor Prokofy caught up with him. With a diagonal sweep down across the left shoulder from behind, he clave the Cossack's body to the belt. Tearing out the stakes of the wattle fence, the crowd poured across the threshing floor into the steppe. Some half-hour later, the crowd ventured to approach Prokofy's farm again. 2 of them crept cautiously into the porch. On the kitchen threshold, in a pool of blood, her head flung back awkwardly, lay Prokofy's wife. Her lips writhed tormentedly back from her teeth. Her gnawed tongue protruded. Prokofy, with shaking head and glassy stare, was wrapping a squealing, crimson, slippery little ball, the prematurely born infant, in a sheepskin. Prokofy's wife died the same evening. His old mother had pity on the child and took charge of it. They plastered it with bran mash, fed it with mare's milk, and after a month, assured that the swarthy, Turkish-looking boy would survive, they carried him to church and christened him. They named him Pantaleimon after his grandfather. Prokofy came back from penal servitude 12 years later. With his clipped, ruddy beard streaked with gray and his Russian clothing, He did not look like a Cossack. He took his son and returned to his farm. Panteleimon grew up darkly swarthy and ungovernable. In face and figure he was like his mother. Prokofy married him to the daughter of a Cossack neighbor. Thenceforth, Turkish blood began to mingle with that of the Cossacks. That was how the hook-nosed, savagely handsome Cossack family of Melyakovs, nicknamed Turks, came into the village. When his father died, Panteleimon took over the farm. He had the hut rethatched, added an acre of common land to the farmyard, built new barns and a granary with a sheet-iron roof. He ordered the tinsmith to cut a couple of cocks from the odd remnants and had them fastened to the roof. They brightened the Melyakov farmyard with their carefree air, giving it a self-satisfied and prosperous appearance. Under the weight of the passing years, Panteleimon Prokofyevich grew stouter. He broadened and stooped somewhat, but still looked a well-built old man. He was dry of bone and lame. In his youth he had broken his leg whilst hurdling at an imperial review of troops. He wore a silver half-moon earring in his left ear, and retained the vivid raven hue of his beard and hair until old age. When angry, he completely lost control of himself, and undoubtedly this had prematurely aged his corpulent wife, Ilinichna, whose face, once beautiful, was now a perfect spider-web of furrows. Pyotr, his elder married son, took after his mother. Stocky and snub-nosed, a luxuriant shock of corn-colored hair, hazel eyes. But the younger Gregor was like his father, half a head taller than Pyotr, some 6 years younger, the same hanging hook nose as his father's, bluish almonds of burning irises in slightly oblique slits, brown, ruddy skin drawn over angular cheekbones. Gregor stooped slightly, just like his father. Even in their smile there was a common, rather savage quality. Dunya, her father's favorite, a long-boned, large-eyed lass, and Pyotr's wife Darya, with her small child, completed the Melyakov household. Chapter 2. Here and there, stars were still piercing through the ashen early morning sky. A wind was blowing from under a bank of cloud. Over the dawn, a mist was rolling high, piling against the slope of a chalky hill, and crawling into the cliff like a gray headless serpent. The left bank of the river, the sands, the backwaters, stony shoals, the dewy weed, quivered with the ecstatic, chilly dawn. Beyond the horizon, the sun yawned and rose not. In the Melyakov hut, Panteleimon Prokofyevich was the first to awake. Buttoning the collar of his cross-stitched shirt as he went, he walked out onto the steps. The grass-grown yard was coated with a dewy silver. He let the cattle out into the street. Darya ran past in her undergarments to milk the cows. The dew sprinkled over the calves of her bare white legs, and she left a smoking, beaten trail behind her over the grass of the yard. Panteleimon Prokofyevich stood for a moment, watching the grass rising from the pressure of Darya's feet, then turned back into the kitchen. On the sill of the wide-open window lay the dead rose petals of the cherry blossoming in the front garden. Gregor was asleep, face downward, his hand flung out back uppermost. "Gregor, coming fishing?" his father called him. "What?" he asked in a whisper, dropping one leg off the bed. "We'll row out and fish till sunrise," Panteleimon proposed. Breathing heavily through his nose, Gregor pulled his everyday trousers down from a peg, drew them on, tucked the legs into his white woolen socks, and slowly drew on his shoes, turning out the infolded flaps. "But has Mother boiled the bait?" he hoarsely asked, as he followed his father into the porch. "Yes. Go to the boat. I'll be after you in a minute." The old man poured the strong-smelling boiled rye into a jug, carefully swept up the fallen grains into his palm, and limped down to the beach. He found his son sitting restively in the boat. "Where shall we go?" Gregor asked. "To the back cliff. We'll try around the log where they were lying the other day." Its stern scraping the ground, the boat settled into the water and broke away from the shore. The current carried it off, rocking it and trying to turn it broadside on. Gregor steered with the oar, but did not row. "Why aren't you rowing?" his father demanded. "We'll get into the middle first." Cutting across the swift mainstream current, the boat moved towards the left bank. Muffled by the water, the crowing of cocks reached them from the village. Its side scraping the black, gravelly cliff rising high above the river, the boat hove to in the pool below. Some 40 feet from the bank, the peeled branches of a sunken elm emerged from the water. Around it, turbulent flecks of foam eddied and swirled. "Pay out the line while I'm tying her fast," Panteleimon whispered. He thrust his hand into the steaming mouth of the jug. The rye scattered audibly over the water, just as though someone had whispered in an undertone, "Shk." Gregor strung some swollen grains on the hook and smiled. "Fish, fish. There are fish both large and small here," the old man ordered. The line fell in spirals into the water and tautened, then slackened again. Gregor set his foot on the edge of the rod and fumbled cautiously for his pouch. "We'll have no luck today, Father. The moon is on the wane," he remarked. "Did you bring the tinder?" "Aha. Give me a light." The old man began to smoke and glanced at the sun, stranded on the farther side of the elm. "You can't tell when a carp will bite," he replied. "Sometimes he will when the moon is waning." The water lapped noisily around the sides of the boat, and a 4-foot carp, gleaming as though cast from ruddy copper, leapt upward with a groan, doubling his broad, curving tail above the water. Granular sprinkles scattered over the boat. "Wait now." Panteleimon wiped his wet beard with his sleeve. At the side of the sunken tree, among the branching, naked boughs, 2 carp leapt simultaneously. A third, smaller, writhed in the air and struggled stubbornly close to the cliff. Gregor impatiently chewed the wet end of the twine. The misty sun was half up. Panteleimon scattered the rest of the bait, and glumly pursing his lips, stolidly watched the motionless end of the rod. Gregor spat out the end of his cigarette, wrathfully watching its rapid flight. He inwardly cursed his father for awakening him so early. Through smoking on an empty stomach, his mouth reeked like burnt bristles. He was about to bend and scoop up some water in his palm, but at that moment the end of the line feebly swayed and slowly sank. "Play him," the old man breathed. Starting up, Gregor seized the rod, but it bent in an arc from his hand, and the end disappeared violently into the water. "Hold him!" Panteleimon muttered as he pushed the boat off from the bank. Gregor attempted to lift the rod, but the fish was too strong, and the stout line snapped with a dry crack. Gregor staggered and almost fell. "Now you can drink," his father cursed, just failing to catch the line as it slipped across the gunwale. Smiling agitatedly, Gregor fastened a new line to the rod and threw out the end. Hardly had the lead touched bottom when the end of the rod bent. "There he is, the devil," Gregor grumbled, with difficulty holding in the fish, which was making for the middle current. The line cut the water with a loud swish, raising a sloping, greenish rampart behind it. Panteleimon picked up the bailer handle in his stumpy fingers. A great red and yellow carp rose to the surface, lashed the water into foam, and dived back into the depths. "Strike till it stings your hand." "No, wait," Gregor exclaimed. "Hold him," his father cried. "I am holding him. Don't let him get under the boat." Taking breath, Gregor drew the carp towards the side of the boat. The old man thrust out the bailer, but with its last strength the carp again disappeared into the depths. "Raise his head. Make him swallow some air, and he'll be quieter," Panteleimon ordered. Once more, Gregor drew the exhausted fish towards the boat. Its nose struck against the rough side, and it lay there with gaping mouth, its orange-golden fins flickering. "We've won!" Panteleimon croaked, lifting the fish in the bailer. They sat on for another half hour, but they had no more battles with carp. "Wind in the line. They won't leap again today," the old man said at last. Griegor pushed off from the bank. As he rode, he saw from his father's face that he wished to say something, but Panteleimon sat silently gazing at the huts of the village scattered under the hill. "Look here, Griegor," he began uncertainly, pulling at the knot of the sack beneath his feet. "I've noticed that you and Aksenia Astachova—" Griegor flushed violently and turned his head away, his shirt collar cut into his muscular, sunburnt neck, pressing out a white band in the flesh. "You watch out, young man," the old man continued, now roughly and angrily. "Stepan's our neighbor, and I won't allow any playing about with his wife. That kind of thing can lead to mischief, and I warn you beforehand. If I see you at it, I'll whip you." Panteleimon twisted his fingers into his gnarled hand and watched the blood ebbing from his son's face. "It's all lies," Griegor snarled and gazed straight into his father's eyes. "Silence! What if people do talk? Hold your tongue, you son of a bitch." Griegor bent to the oars. The boat leapt forward. The water, rocking behind the stern, danced away in little scrolls. They remained silent until, as they were approaching the shore, his father reminded Griegor, "You look out. Don't forget what I've said, or from today I'll stop your little game. Not a step will you stir outside the yard." Griegor made no answer. As he beached the boat, he asked, "Shall I hand the fish to the women?" "Take and sell it to Mochov, the merchant," the old man said more gently. "You can have the money for tobacco." Biting his lips, Griegor followed his father, his eyes wrathfully gnawing the back of the old man's head. "Try it, father. I'm going out tonight even if you hobble me," he was thinking. At the farm gate he ran into his old friend, Mitka Korshunov. Mitka was playing with the end of his silver-studded belt as he walked along. His round, yellow eyes gleamed greasily in their narrow slits. His irises were long, like a cat's, giving him a shifty and evasive look. "Where are you off to with the fish?" Mitka asked. "We caught it today. I'm going to sell it to Mochov." With a glance, Mitka estimated the weight of the fish. 15 pounds, he guessed, and a half. We weighed it on the steel yard. "Take me with you. I'll do the selling for you," Mitka proposed. "Come on, then. And what do I get?" "You needn't fear. We shan't quarrel over that," Griegor laughed. Mass was just ended, and the villagers were scattering through the streets. The three brothers, nicknamed Shamil, came striding down the road, side by side. The eldest, armless Alexei, was in the middle. The tight collar of his army tunic held his veiny neck erect, his thin, curly, pointed little beard twisted provokingly sideways. His left eye winked nervously. His carbine had exploded in his hands at the shooting butts many years previously, and a piece of the flying iron had plowed into his cheek. Thenceforth his left eye had winked in season and out of season, and a blue scar furrowed across his cheek to bury itself in his toe of hair. The left arm had been torn off at the elbow, but Alexei was past master at rolling a cigarette with one hand. He could press his pouch against his chest, tear off the right quantity of paper with his teeth, would bend it into a trough shape, rake up the tobacco, and roll the cigarette almost before you realized what he was doing. Although he was armless, he was the finest fighter in the village. His fist was not particularly large, as fists go, the size of a calabash, but if he happened to get annoyed with his bullock when plowing, and had mislaid his whip, he would give it a blow with his fist, and the bullock would be stretched out over the furrows, blood streaming from its ears. And there it would lie. The other brothers, Martin and Prochor, resembled Alexei down to the last detail. They were just as stocky and broad-shouldered, only each had 2 arms. As he came up with Mitka and Griegor, Alexei winked 5 times in succession. "Selling your load?" he asked. "Want to buy it?" Griegor replied. "How much do you want for it? A couple of bullocks and a wife thrown in?" Winking violently, Alexei waved the stump of his arm. "You're a funny lad. A wife thrown in. And you'll take the offspring, too?" "Clear off, or there will be some Shamils missing," Griegor snarled. On the square, the villagers were gathered around the church palings. In the middle of a ring of people, a grizzled old man, his chest covered with crosses and medals, was waving his arms about. "My old grandfather Grishaka is telling one of his tales about the Turkish war," Mitka directed Gregor's attention with a glance. "Let's go and listen." "While we're listening to him, the carp will start stinking and swell," Gregor objected. On the square behind the fire-cart shed rose the green roof of Mochov's house. Striding past the shed, the two lads approached the steps. The balustrade was ornamented with wild vine entwined in the railings. On the steps lay a speckled, lazy shade. "See how some folk live, Mitka?" Gregor said. "A handle, and gilt, too," Mitka sniffed as he opened the door leading to the veranda. "Who is there?" someone called from the other side of the door. Suddenly smitten with shyness, Gregor went in. The tail of the carp dragged over the painted floorboards. "Whom do you want?" A girl was sitting in a wicker rocking chair, a dish of strawberries in her hand. Gregor stared silently at the full, rosy, heart-shaped lips embracing a berry. Raising her head, the girl looked the lads up and down. The berry rested patiently in the warm lips. Mitka came to Gregor's help. He coughed and asked, "Want to buy some fish?" Her lips opened to admit the berry, and then smiled swiftly, almost imperceptibly. "Fish? I'll tell you in a moment." She rocked the chair upright, and rising, slapped off in her embroidered slippers. The sun shone through her white dress, and Mitka saw the dim outline of full legs and the broad, billowing lace of her underskirt. He was astonished at the satiny whiteness of her bare calves. Only on the cushioned little heels was the skin milkily yellow. "Look, Grishka, what a dress, like glass. You can see everything through it," he said, nudging the carp instead of Gregor. The girl came back through the door, leading to the corridor, and sat down gently on the chair. "Go into the kitchen," she ordered. Gregor tiptoed into the house. When he had gone, Mitka stood blinking at the white thread of the parting dividing the girl's hair into two golden half-circles. She studied him with saucy, restless eyes. "Are you from the village?" she asked. "Yes, Korshanov's." "And what is your name?" "Mitka." She attentively examined her rosy nails, and with a swift movement tucked up her legs. "Which of you caught the fish?" she continued her cross-examination. "My friend Gregor." "And do you fish too?" "When I feel like it." "With angles?" "Yes." "I'd like to go fishing sometime," she said after a silence. "All right, I'll take you if you want to." "How is it to be done? Really, are you serious?" "We must get up very early," Mitka declared. "I'll get up, only you'll have to waken me." "I can do that. But how about your father?" "What about my father?" Mitka smiled. "He might take me for a thief. The dogs will have to be baited." "That's simple. I sleep alone in the corner room. That's the window." She pointed with her finger. "If you come for me, knock at the window and I'll get up." The sound of Gregor's timid voice and the thick, oily tones of the cook came brokenly from the kitchen. Mitka was silent, fingering the tarnished silver of his belt. "Are you married?" she asked, warming with a secretive smile. "Why?" "Oh, I'm just curious." "No, I'm single." Mitka suddenly blushed, and she, playing with a smile and a little twig from the hothouse strawberries scattered over the floor, queried, "And are the girls fond of you, Mitka?" "Some are, some aren't." "You don't say. And why have you got eyes like a cat?" "A cat?" Mitka was now completely abashed. "Yes, that's just it. They're cat's eyes." "I must have got them from my mother. I can't help it." "And why don't they marry you, Mitka?" Mitka recovered from his momentary confusion, and sensing the hidden sneer in her words, twinkled the yellows of his eyes. "My wife hasn't grown up yet." She raised her eyebrows in astonishment, bridled up, and rose from her seat. Her fleeting smile lashed Mitka like a nettle. There was the sound of footsteps ascending the steps from the street. Shuffling softly along in his capacious kid boots, the master of the house, Sergei Platonovich Mukhov, carried his corpulent body with dignity past Mitka. "Want me?" he asked as he passed, without turning his head. "He's brought some fish, Papa," the girl replied. Griegor came out with empty hands. Chapter 3. The first cock had crowed when Griegor returned from his evening out. From the porch came the scent of over-sour hops and the spicy perfume of stitchwort. He tiptoed into the hut, undressed, carefully hung up his Sunday-striped trousers, crossed himself, and lay down. A golden, criss-crossed pool of moonlight lay on the floor. In the corner, under embroidered towels, was the tarnished luster of silvered icons. From the shelf over the bed came the droning hum of agitated flies. He would have fallen asleep, but in the kitchen his brother's infant started to cry. The cradle began to creak like an ungreased cartwheel. He heard his brother's wife Darya mutter in a sleepy voice, "Sleep, little brat. Neither rest nor peace do I get with you." She quietly crooned a lullaby to the child. As he dozed off under the measured, soothing creak, Griegor remembered, "Why, tomorrow Pyotr goes off to the camp. Darya will be left with the baby. We'll have to do the mowing without him." He was aroused from sleep by a prolonged neighing. By its tone, he recognized Pyotr's army horse. Helpless with sleep, his fingers were slow in buttoning up his shirt, and he almost dropped off again under the flowing rhythm of Darya's song. "And where are the geese? They've gone into the reeds. And where are the reeds? The girls have pulled them up. And where are the girls? The girls have taken husbands. And where are the Cossacks? They've gone to the war." Rubbing his eyes, Griegor made his way to the stable and led Pyotr's horse out into the street. A flying cobweb tickled his face, and his drowsiness unexpectedly left him. Along the dawn lay a slantingly undulating, never-trodden track of moonlight. Over the dawn hung a mist, and above it a starry grain. The horse set its hind hoofs down cautiously. The drop to the water was bad going. From the farther side of the river came the quacking of ducks. A sheatfish turned and darted over the water above the mud by the bank, hunting at random for smaller fry. Griegor stood a long time by the river. The bank exuded a dank and sickly rottenness. A tiny drop of water fell from the horse's lips. A light, pleasant void was in Griegor's heart. Life was good and free from care. The red-tailed dawn was pecking up the starry grain from the dove-colored floor of heaven. Close to the stable, he ran into his mother. "That you, Grishka?" she asked. "And who else should it be? Watered the horse?" "Yes," he answered shortly. Carrying some dried dung for fuel, his mother ran back to the hut, her withered, bare feet slapping on the ground. "You might go and wake up the Astachovs. Stepan said he would go with our Pyotr," she called. The morning rawness set a spring stiffly quivering in Griegor. His body tingled with prickles. He ran up the 3 echoing steps leading to the Astachovs' hut. The door was on the latch. Stepan was asleep on an outspread rug in the kitchen, his wife's head on his breast. In the graying twilight, Griegor saw Aksinia's shift wrinkled above her knees, and her birch-white, unashamedly parted legs. For a moment he stood gazing, feeling his mouth going dry and his head bursting with an iron clangor. His eyes wandered. In a strange, hoarse voice he called, "Hey! Anyone here? Get up!" Aksinia started out of her sleep. "Oh, who's that?" She hurriedly began to fumble with her shift, and in drawing it down, her bare arm was entangled in her legs. A little drop of spittle was left on her pillow. A woman's sleep is heavy at dawn. "It's me. Mother sent me to wake you up." "We'll be up in a minute. We're sleeping on the floor because of the fleas." "Stepan, get up, do you hear?" By her voice, Griegor guessed that she felt awkward, and he hastened to get out. 30 Cossacks were going from the village to the May training camp. Just before 7 o'clock, wagons with tarpaulin covers, Cossacks on foot and on horseback, in sailcloth shirts and carrying their equipment, began to stream towards the square. Gregor found Pyotr standing on the steps hurriedly stitching a broken rein. His father, Panteleimon, was attending to Pyotr's horse, pouring oats into a trough. "Not finished eating yet?" Pyotr asked, nodding towards the horse. "He's hungry," his father replied, deliberately, testing the saddle-cloth with his rough palm. "Let even a crumb stick to the cloth, and it will chafe the animal's back into a sore in one march." "When he's finished eating, he must have a drink, father." "Gregor will take him down to the Don," Panteleimon answered. Gregor took the high, raw-boned Don horse with a white star on its forehead, led it outside the gate, and resting his left hand lightly on its withers, vaulted onto its back and went off at a swinging trot. He tried to rein the horse in at the descent to the river, but the animal stumbled, quickened its pace, and flew down the slope. As he flung himself back and almost lay along the animal's spine, Gregor saw a woman with pails going down the hill. He turned sharply off the path and dashed into the water, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. Aksenia Astachova came swinging down the slope. When still some little distance away, she shouted to him, "You mad devil, you almost rode me down. You wait, I'll tell your father how you ride." "Now, neighbor, don't get angry. When you've seen your husband off to the camp, maybe I'll be useful on your farm," he replied. "How the devil would you be useful to me?" "When mowing time comes, you may yet be asking me," Gregor smiled. Aksenia dexterously drew a full pail of water from the river and pressed her skirt between her knees away from the wind. "So they're taking your Stepan?" Gregor asked. "What's that to do with you?" "What a spitfire, can't I ask?" "Well, they are taking him, and what of it?" "So you'll be left a grass widow?" "Yes." The horse raised its lips from the water and stood gazing across the Don, its forefeet treading the stream. Aksenia filled her second pail, hoisted the yoke across her shoulders, and set off up the slope. Gregor turned the horse and followed her. The wind fluttered her skirt and played with the fine, fluffy curls on her swarthy neck. Her flat, embroidered cap flamed on her heavy knot of hair. Her rose-colored shirt, gathered into her skirt at the waist, tightly embraced her back and shoulders. As she climbed the slope, she bent forward, and the hollow between her shoulders showed clearly beneath her shirt. Gregor watched her every movement. He badly wanted to renew the talk with her. "You'll be missing your husband, won't you?" he asked. Aksenia turned her head and smiled without halting. "And how else? You get married," she spoke pantingly. "Marry, and you'll know whether you miss your friend or not." Gregor brought the horse level with her and gazed into her eyes. "But other wives are glad when their husbands go. Our Daria will grow fat without her Pyotr," he remarked. "A husband's not a leech, but he sucks your blood all the same." "Shall we be seeing you married soon?" she asked. "I don't know. It depends on father. After my army service, I suppose." "You're still young. Don't get married." And Quiet Flows the Don by Mikhail Sholokhov continued. "You're still young. Don't get married." "Why not?" "It's nothing but sorrow." She looked up under her brows and smiled grimly without parting her lips. For the first time, Gregor noticed that her lips were shamelessly greedy and swollen. Combing his horse's mane with his fingers, he replied, "I've no desire to get married. Someone loves me already as I am." "Have you noticed anyone, then?" "What should I notice? Now you're seeing your Stepan off." "Don't try to play about with me. I'll tell Stepan." "I'll show your Stepan." "Mind you don't cry first, my brave." "Don't alarm me, Aksenia." "I'm not alarming you. Let other girls hem your tear wipers, but keep your eyes off me. I'll look at you all the more now." "Well, look, then." Aksenia smiled pacifically and left the track, seeking to pass round the horse. Gregor turned the animal sideways and blocked the road. "Let me pass, Grishka." "I won't." "Don't be a fool. I must see to my husband." Gregor smilingly teased the horse, and it edged Aksenia towards the cliff. "Let me pass, you devil. There are people over there. If they see us, what will they think?" she muttered. She swept a frightened glance around and passed by, frowning, and without a backward look. Pyotr was saying goodbye to his family on the steps. Gregor saddled the horse. His brother hurried down the steps and took the reins. Scenting the road, the horse fretted and chewed the bit. With one foot in the stirrup, Pyotr said to his father, "Don't overwork the bald heads, father. Come autumn, we'll sell them. Gregor will need an army horse, you know. And don't sell the steppe grass. You know yourself what hay there'll be in the meadow this year." "Well, God be with you. It's time you were off," the old man replied, crossing himself. Pyotr flung his bulky body into the saddle and adjusted the folds of his shirt in his belt at the back. The horse moved towards the gate. The saber swung to the rhythm of the motion, and its pommel glittered dully in the sun. Darya followed with the child on her arm. Wiping her eyes with her sleeve, his mother, Ilinichna, stood in the middle of the yard. "Brother, the pasties! You've forgotten the pasties, the potato pasties!" Dunya ran to the gate. "He left his pasties behind," she groaned, leaning against the gate-post, and tears ran down her greasy, burning cheeks onto her jacket. Darya stood gazing under her hand after her husband's white, dusty shirt. Shaking the rotting gate-post, old Panteleimon looked at Gregor. "Take and mend the gate and put a new post in." He stood in thought a moment, then communicated the news. "Pyotr's gone." Through the wattle fence, Gregor saw Stepan getting ready. Aksenia, bedecked in a green woolen skirt, led out his horse. Stepan smilingly said something to her. Unhurriedly, in lordly fashion, he kissed his wife, and his arm lingered long around her shoulder. His sunburnt and work-stained hand showed coal-black against her white jacket. He stood with his back to Gregor, his stiff, clean-shaven neck, his broad, somewhat heavy shoulders, and whenever he bent towards his wife, the twisted end of his light-brown mustache were visible across the fence. Aksenia laughed at something and shook her head. Sitting as though rooted into the saddle, Stepan rode his black horse at a hurried walk through the gate, and Aksenia walked at his side, holding the stirrup, and looking up lovingly and thirstily into his eyes. With a long, unwinking stare, Gregor watched them to the turn of the road. Towards evening a thunderstorm gathered. A mass of heavy cloud lay over the village. Lashed into fury by the wind, the Don sent great foaming breakers against its banks. The sky flamed with dry lightning. Occasional peals of thunder shook the earth. A vulture circled with outspread wings below the clouds, and ravens croakingly pursued him. Breathing out coolness, the cloud passed down the Don from the east. Beyond the water meadows, the heaven blackened menacingly. The steppe lay in an expectant silence. In the village, the closed shutters rattled. The old people hurried home, crossing themselves. A gray pillar of dust whirled over the square, and the heat-burdened earth was already beginning to be sown with the first grains of rain. Shaking her braided tresses, Dunya ran across the yard, clapped fast the door of the chicken house, and stood in the middle of the yard with nostrils distended like a horse scenting danger. In the street, the children were kicking up their heels. 8-year-old Mishka, his father's absurdly large, peaked cap drawn over his eyes, was spinning round and piercingly chirruping, "Rain, rain, go away, we're going off for the day, to pay God our vow, and to Christ to bow." Dunya enviously watched Mishka's scarred, bare feet brutally trampling the ground. She, too, wanted to dance in the rain and to get her hair wet so that her hair might grow thick and curly. She, too, wanted to stand on her hands like Mishka's friend in the roadside dust, at the risk of falling into the nettles. But her mother was watching, and angrily moving her lips at the window. With a sigh, she ran into the house. The rain was now falling heavily. A peal of thunder broke right over the roof and went rolling away across the dawn. In the porch, Panteleimon and perspiring Griegor were hauling a folded dragnet out of the side room. "Raw thread and a pack needle, quick!" Griegor called to Dunya. Darya sat down to mend the net. Her mother-in-law grumbled as she rocked the baby. "You're beyond belief, old man. We could go to bed. Light costs more and more, and yet you go on burning it. What are you up to now? Where the plague are you going? And you'll get drowned into the bargain. The terror of the Lord is in the yard. Hark how it shakes the house. Lord Jesus Christ, Queen of Heaven." For a moment it became dazzlingly blue and silent in the kitchen. The rain could be heard drumming on the shutters. A clap of thunder followed. Dunya whimpered and buried her face in the net. Darya signed the cross towards the windows and door. The old woman stared with terrible eyes down at the cat rubbing itself against her legs. "Dunya, chase this cat away," she exclaimed. "Queen of Heaven, forgive me my sins. Dunya, turn the cat out into the yard. Stop it, unclean power. May you—" Dropping the net, Griegor shook with silent laughter. "Well, what are you grinning at? Enough of that," his father shouted at him. "Hurry with your mending, women. I told you the other day to see to the net." "And what fish do you expect to catch?" his wife stammered. "If you don't understand, hold your tongue. The fish will make for the bank now. They're afraid of storms. I fear the water will be turned muddy already. Run, Dunya, and see whether you can hear the watercourses running." Dunya edged unwillingly towards the door. Old Ilinichna would not be repressed. "Who's going to wade with you? Darya mustn't. She may catch cold in her breast," she persisted. "Me and Griegor. And for the other net, we'll call Aksenia and another of the women." Dunya ran in, out of breath. Drops of rain hung trembling on her lashes. She smelt of the dank black earth. "The courses are roaring like anything," she panted. "Put on your coat and run to Aksenia," her father told her. "If she'll go, ask her to fetch Malashka Frolova, too." Dunya quickly returned with the women. Aksenia, in a blue skirt and a ragged jacket belted with rope, looked shorter and thinner. Exchanging laughs with Darya, she took off her kerchief, wound her hair into a tighter knot, and throwing back her head, stared coldly at Griegor. As corpulent Malashka tied up her stocking, she said hoarsely, "Have you got the sacks? True God, we'll stir up the fish today." They all went into the yard. The rain was still falling heavily. The puddles frothed and crawled in streams down toward the dawn. Griegor led the way down to the river. "Aren't we near the landing place yet, Griegor?" his father asked after a while. "Here we are." "Begin from here," Panteleimon shouted, attempting to drown the howling wind. "Can't hear you, Granddad," Malashka called throatily. "Start wading, for God's sake," he replied. "I'll take the deep side. The deep, I say." "Malashka, you deaf devil, where are you dragging to? I'll go out into the deeps. Griegor, let Aksenia take the bank." A groaning roar from the dawn. The wind was tearing the slanting sheet of rain to shreds. Feeling the bottom with his feet, Griegor waded up to his waist into the water. A clammy cold crept into his chest, drawing tightly in a ring round his heart. The waves lashed his face and tightly screwed-up eyes like a knout. The net bellied out and was carried off into the deeps. Griegor's feet, shod in woolen socks, slipped over the sandy bottom. The net was dragged out of his hand. Deeper, deeper, a sudden drop. His legs were carried away. The current snatched him up and bore him towards the middle stream. With his right hand he vigorously paddled back to the bank. The black, swirling depths frightened him as never before. His feet joyously found the muddy bottom. A fish knocked against his knee. Again the net heeled over and slipped out into the depths. Again the current carried the ground away from under his feet, and Griagor swam, spitting out water. "Aksenia, you all right?" he called. "All right so far," he heard her answer. "Isn't the rain stopping?" "The fine rain stopping and a heavy rain beginning." "Talk quietly. If my father hears, he'll go for me." "Afraid of your father, too?" she sneered. For a moment they hauled in silence. "Grishka, there's a sunken tree by the bank, I think. We must get the net round it." A terrible buffet flung Griagor far away from her. "Ah! Ah!" Aksenia screamed somewhere near the bank. Terrified, he swam in the direction of her call. "Aksenia!" Wind and the flowing roar of the water. "Aksenia!" Griagor shouted again, going cold with fear. He struck out at random. He felt something slipping beneath his feet and caught it with his hand. It was the net. "Grishka, where are you?" he heard Aksenia's tearful voice. "Why didn't you answer my shout?" he bawled angrily, crawling on hands and knees up the bank. Squatting down on his heels, he tremblingly disentangled the net. The moon peeled out of a slash of broken cloud. There was a restrained mutter of thunder beyond the water meadows. The earth gleamed with moisture. Washed clean by the rain, the sky was stern and clear. As he disentangled the net, Griagor stared at Aksenia. Her face was a chalky white, but her red, slightly upturned lips were smiling. "As I was knocked against the bank," she said, "I went out of my mind. I was frightened to death. I thought you were drowned." Their hands touched. Aksenia attempted to thrust hers into the sleeve of his shirt. "How warm it is up your arm," she said mournfully, "and I'm frozen." Someone came running along the bank. Griagor guessed it to be Dunya. He shouted to her, "Got the thread?" "Yes. What are you sitting here for? Father sent me for you to come at once to the point. We've caught a sackful of sterlet." Unconcealed triumph sounded in her voice. With teeth chattering, Aksenia sewed up the holes in the net. Then, to get warm, they ran at full speed to the point. Panteleimon was rolling a cigarette with scarred fingers, swollen by the water. He danced and boasted. "The first time 8 fish, and the second time—" He paused and silently pointed with his foot to the sack. Aksenia stared inquisitively. From it came the swishing sound of stirring fish. "Well, we'll wade in once more up to our knees and then home. In you go, Grishka. What are you waiting for?" his father asked. Griagor stepped out with numbed legs. Aksenia was trembling so much that he felt her movement at the other end of the net. "Don't shake." "I'd be glad not to, but I can't get my breath." "Listen, let's crawl out and damn the fish." At that moment a great carp bored through the net like a golden corkscrew. Griagor hurried and folded the net over it. Aksenia ran out onto the bank. The water splashed on the sands and ran back. A fish lay quivering in the net. "Back through the meadow?" she asked. "The wood is nearer," Griagor replied. Frowning, Aksenia wrung out her skirt, flung the sack over her shoulder, and set off almost at a trot. Griagor picked up the net. They had covered some 200 yards when Aksenia began to groan. "I've no strength left." "Look, there's a last year's haycock. You might get warm inside it," he suggested. "Good. While I'm getting home, I might die." Griagor turned back the top of the cock and dug out a hole. The long-lying hay smelt warm and rotten. "Crawl into the middle. It's like a stove here," he told her. She threw down the sack and buried herself up to the neck in hay. Shivering with cold, Griagor lay down at her side. A tender, agitating scent came from her damp hair. She lay with head thrown back, breathing regularly through her half-open mouth. "Your hair smells like henbane, you know. The white flower," Griagor whispered, bending towards her. She was silent. Her gaze was misty and distant, fixed on the waning crescent moon. Taking his hand out of his pocket, Griagor suddenly drew her head towards him. She tore herself away fiercely and raised herself from the hay. "Let me go," she demanded. "Keep quiet. Let me go or I'll shout." "Wait, Aksenia." "Daddy Panteleimon, have you lost yourselves?" Panteleymon's voice sounded quite close. From beyond a clump of hawthorn bush, grinding his teeth, Gregor jumped out of the cock. "What are you shouting for? Are you lost?" the old man questioned as he approached. Aksenia stood by the haycock, adjusting her kerchief, steam rising from her. "We're not lost, but I'm all but frozen," she answered. "Look, woman, there's a haycock. Warm yourself," the old man told her. Aksenia smiled as she stooped to pick up the sack. From Tatarsk to Sholokhov, the training camp center, it was some 40 miles. Pyotr Melyukhov and Stepan Astachov rode in the same covered wagon. With them were 3 others from their village. Fyodor Bodovskov, a young Kalmyk-faced and pockmarked Cossack, Kristonia Tokin, a second reservist in the Ataman's regiment of lifeguards, and the artilleryman Ivan Tomilin. After the first halt for food, they harnessed Kristonia's and Astachov's horses into the wagon, and the other horses were tethered behind. Kristonia, strong and crack-brained like all the men of the Ataman's regiment, took the reins. He sat in front with bowed back, shading the light from the interior of the wagon, urging on the horses with his deep, rumbling bass voice. Pyotr, Stepan, and Tomilin lay smoking under the tightly stretched tarpaulin cover. Bodovskov walked behind. Kristonia's wagon led the way. Behind trailed 7 or 8 others, leading saddled and unsaddled horses behind them. The road was noisy with laughter, shouts, songs, the snorting of horses and the jingling of empty stirrups. Under Pyotr's head was his bag of biscuit. He lay, twirling his tawny whiskers. "Stepan," he said. "Ah? Let's have a song." "It's too hot. My mouth's all dried out." "There are no taverns anywhere near, so don't wait for that." "Well, sing up, only you're no good at it. Your Grishka now, he can sing. His isn't a voice, it's a pure silver thread." Stepan threw back his head, coughed, and began in a low, tuneful voice. "Hey, the ruddy, flushing sunrise early came up in the sky." Tomilin put his palm against his cheek and caught up the refrain in a thin, wailing undertone. Smiling, Pyotr watched the little knots of veins on his temples going blue with his efforts. Young was she, the little woman, went for water to the stream. Stepan, who was lying with his head towards Kristonia, turned round on his elbow. "Kristonia, join in," he ordered. And the lad, he guessed her purpose, saddled he his chestnut mare. Stepan turned his smiling glance towards Pyotr, and Pyotr added his voice, opening wide his heavily bearded jaws. Kristonia roared in a voice that shook the tarpaulin cover. Saddled he his chestnut mare, overtook the little woman. Kristonia set his bare foot against the cross-tree and waited for Pyotr to begin again. Closing his eyes, his perspiring face in a shadow, Stepan affably sang on, now dropping his voice to a whisper, then causing it to ring out metallically. Let me, little woman, water my mare in the stream." And again Kristonia joined in with his alarming howl. Voices from the neighboring wagons took up the song. The wheels clashed on their iron frames, the horses snorted with the dust. A white-winged peewit flew up from the parching steppe. It flew with a cry into a hollow, watching the chain of wagons, the horses kicking up clouds of white dust with their hoofs, the men in white dusty shirts walking at the edge of the road. Stepan stood up on the wagon, holding the tarpaulin with one hand, beating a rough time with the other, and sang on. Fyodor Bodovskov whistled. The horses strained at the traces. Leaning out of the wagon, Pyotr laughed and waved his cap. Stepan, gleaming with a dazzling smile, impudently swung his shoulders. Along the road, the dust rolled in a cloud. Kristonia jumped out of the wagon in his unbelted overlong shirt, his hair matted and wet with sweat, did the Cossack dance, whirling in a swinging circle, frowning and groaning, and leaving the monstrous, spreading marks of his bare feet in the silky gray dust. They stopped for the night by a barrow with a sandy summit. Clouds gathered from the west. Rain dripped out of their black wings. The horses were watered at a pond. Above the dike, dismal willows bowed before the wind. In the water, covered with stagnant duckweed and scaled with miserable little ripples, the lightning was distortedly reflected. The wind scattered the raindrops as though showering largesse into the earth's swarthy palms. The fettered horses were turned out to graze, 3 men being appointed as guards. The other men lit fires and hung pots on the cross-trees of the wagons. Kristonia was cooking millet. As he stirred it with a spoon, he told a story to the Cossacks sitting around. The barrow was high, like this one, and I says to my dead father, "Won't the ataman stop us for digging up the barrow without his being asked?" "What is he lying about?" asked Stepan as he came back from the horses. "I'm telling how me and my dead father looked for treasure. It was the Merkelov barrow. Well, and father says, 'Come on, Kristonia, we'll dig up the Merkelov barrow.' He'd heard from his father that treasure was buried in it. Father promised God, 'Give me the treasure and I'll build a fine church.' So we agreed and off we went. It was on common land, so only the ataman could stop us. We arrived late in the afternoon. We waited until nightfall and then set to work with shovels at the crown. We began to dig straight down from the top. We dug a hole 6 feet deep. The earth was like stone. I was wet through. Father kept on muttering prayers, but believe me, brothers, my belly was grumbling so much. You know what we eat in summer, sour milk and kvass. My dead father, he says, 'Phew,' he says, 'Kristin, you're a heathen. Here am I praying, and you can't keep your food down. I can't breathe for the stink. Crawl out of the barrow, you, or I'll split your head open with the shovel. Through you the treasure may sink into the ground.' I lay outside the barrow and suffer with my belly, and my dead father, a strong man he was, goes on digging all alone. And he digs down to a stone plate. He calls me, I push a crowbar under it and lift it up. Believe me, brothers, it was a moonlight night, and under this plate was such a shine." "Now you are lying, Kristonia," Pyotr broke in, smiling and tugging at his whiskers. "How am I lying? Go to the devil and to the devil's dam." Kristonia gave a hitch to his broad-bottomed trousers and glanced around his hearers. "No, I'm not lying. It's God's truth. There it's shown. I look, and it's charcoal, some 40 bushels of it. Father says, 'Crawl in, Kristin, and dig it up.' I dig out this rubbish. I went on digging till daylight. In the morning I look, and there he is." "Who?" asked Tamilin. "Why, the ataman. Who else? He happens to come driving by. 'Who gave you permission?' and all the rest of it. He lays hold of us and hauls us off to the village. We were called before the court at Kaminskaya the year before last, but father, he guessed what was coming, and managed to die beforehand. We wrote back saying he was not among the living." Kristonia took his pot with the boiling millet and went to the wagon for spoons. "Well, what of your father? He promised to build a church. Didn't he do it?" Stepan asked when he returned. "You're a fool, Stepan. How could he build with coal? Once he promised, he ought to have done it. There was no agreement whatever about coal, and the treasure—" The flames of the fire shook with the laughter that arose. Kristonia raised his head from the pot, and not understanding what the laughter was about, drowned all the rest with his heavy roar. Aksenia was 17 when she was given in marriage to Stepan Astachov. She came from the village of Dubrovka, from the sands on the other side of the Don. About a year before her marriage, she was plowing in the steppe some 5 miles from the village. In the night, her father, a man of some 50 years, tied her hands and raped her. "I'll kill you if you breathe a word, but if you keep quiet, I'll buy you a plush jacket and gaiters with galoshes. Remember, I'll kill you if you—" he promised her. Aksenia ran back through the night in her torn petticoat to the village. She flung herself at her mother's feet and sobbed out the whole story. Her mother and elder brother harnessed horses into the wagon, made Aksenia get in with them, and drove to the father. Her brother almost drove the horses to death in the 5 miles. They found the old man close to the field camp. He was lying in a drunken sleep on his overcoat, with an empty vodka bottle by his side. Before Aksinia's eyes, her brother unhooked the swing tree from the wagon, picked up his father by the feet, curtly asked him a question or two, and struck him a blow with the iron-shod swing tree between the eyes. He and his mother went on beating steadily for an hour and a half. The aging and always meek mother frenziedly tore at her senseless husband's hair. The brother used his feet. Aksinia lay under the wagon, her head covered, silently shaking. They carried her father home just before dawn. He lay bellowing mournfully, his eyes wandering around the room, seeking for Aksinia, who had hidden herself away. Blood and matter ran from his torn ear onto the pillow. Towards evening, he died. They told the neighbors he had fallen from the wagon. Within a year, the matchmakers came on a gaily bedecked wagonette to ask for Aksinia's hand. The tall, stiff-necked, and well-proportioned Stepan approved of his future bride, and the wedding was fixed for the autumn. The day was frosty and ringingly icy. Aksinia was installed as young mistress of the Astrakov household. The morning after the festivities, her mother-in-law, a tall old woman doubled up with some female complaint, woke Aksinia up, led her into the kitchen, and aimlessly shifting things about, said to her, "Now, dear little daughter, we've taken you not for love, nor for you to lie abed. Go and milk the cows, and then get some food ready. I'm old and feeble. You must take over the household. It will all fall on you." The same day, Stepan took his young wife into the barn and beat her deliberately and terribly. He beat her on the belly, the breast, and the back, taking care that the marks should not be visible to others. After that he neglected her, kept company with flighty grass widows, and went out almost every night, first locking Aksinia into the barn or the room. For 18 months, so long as there was no child, he would not forgive her his disgrace. Then he was quieter, but was niggardly with caresses and rarely spent the night at home. The large farm with its numerous cattle burdened Aksinia with work. Stepan was lazy and went off to smoke, to play cards, to learn the latest news, and Aksinia had to do everything. Her mother-in-law was a poor help. After bustling around a little, she would drop onto the bed, and with lips tight drawn and eyes gazing agonizedly at the ceiling, would lie groaning, rolled into a bundle. Throwing down her work, Aksinia would hide in a corner and stare at her mother-in-law's face in fear and pity. The old woman died some 18 months after the marriage. In the morning, Aksinia was taken in travail, and about noon, an hour or so before the child's entry into the world, the grandmother dropped dead by the stable door. The midwife ran out to warn tipsy Stepan not to go into the bedroom, and saw the old woman lying with her legs tucked up beneath her. After the birth of the child, Aksinia devoted herself to her husband, but she had no feeling for him, only bitter womanly pity and force of habit. The child died within the year. The old life was resumed, and when Griegor Melyakov crossed Aksinia's path, she realized with terror that she was attracted to the swarthy youngster. He waited on her stubbornly, with bulldog insistence. She saw that he was not afraid of Stepan. She felt that he would not hold back because of him, and without consciously desiring it, resisting the feeling with all her might, she noticed that on Sundays and weekdays she was attiring herself more carefully. Making pretexts to herself, she sought to place herself more frequently in his path. She was happy to find Griegor's black eyes caressing her heavily and rapturously. When she awoke of a morning and went to milk the cows, she smiled and, without realizing why, recalled, "Today's a happy day. But why? Oh, Griegor, Grishka." She was frightened by the new feeling which filled her, and in her thoughts she went gropingly, cautiously, as though crossing the dawn over the broken ice of March. After seeing Stepan off to camp, she decided to see Griegor as little as possible. After the fishing expedition, her decision was still further strengthened. Chapter 4. Some 2 days before Trinity, the distribution of the village meadowland took place. Panteleimon attended the allotment. He came back at dinner time, threw off his boots with a groan, and noisily scratching his weary legs, announced, "Our portion lies close to the Red Cliff, not over good grass as grass goes. The upper part runs up to the forest. It's just scrub in places, and spear grass coming through." "When shall we do the mowing?" Griegor asked. "After the holidays." The old wife opened the oven door with a clatter and drew out the warmed-up cabbage soup. Panteleimon sat over the meal a long time, telling of the day's events, and of the knavish ataman who had all but swindled the whole assembly of Cossacks. "But who's going to do the raking and stacking, Dad?" Dunya asked timidly. "I can't do it all by myself." "We'll ask Aksenia Astakhov. Stepan asked us to mow for him." 2 mornings later, Mitka Korshunov rode off on his white-legged stallion up to the Melyakov yard. A fine rain was falling. A heavy mist hung over the village. Mitka leant out of his saddle, opened the wicket, and rode in. The old wife called to him from the steps. "Hey, you rapscallion, what do you want?" she asked with evident dissatisfaction in her voice. The old lady had no love for the desperate and quarrelsome Mitka. "And what do you want, Ilinichna?" Mitka said in surprise, as he tied his horse to the balustrade of the steps. "I want Griegor. Where is he?" "He's asleep under the shed. But have you had a stroke? Have you lost the use of your legs that you must ride?" "You're always sticking in your spoke, old lady," Mitka took umbrage. Smacking an elegant whip against the legs of his polished boots, he went to look for Griegor and found him asleep in a cart. Screwing up his left eye as though taking aim, Mitka tugged at Griegor's hair. "Get up, peasant." Peasant was the most abusive word Mitka could think of using. Griegor jumped up as though on springs. "What do you want?" he demanded. Mitka sat down on the side of the cart, and scraping the dried mud off his boots with a stick, he said, "I've been insulted, Grishka." "Well?" "You see, it's—" Mitka cursed heavily. "He's a troop commander, he says." He threw out the words angrily, not opening his mouth, his legs trembling. Griegor got up. "What troop commander?" Seizing him by the sleeve, Mitka said more quietly, "Saddle your horse at once and come to the meadows. I'll show him." I said to him, "Come on, Your Excellency, and we'll see. Bring all your friends and comrades," he said. "I'll beat the lot of you. The mother of my mare took prizes at the officers' hurdle races at Petersburg. What are his mare and mother to me? Curse them. I won't let them outrace my stallion." Griegor hastily dressed. Choking with wrath, Mitka hurried him up. "He has come on a visit to the Mochovs. Wait, what is his name? Listnitsky, I think. He's stout and serious-looking and wears glasses. Well, and let him. His glasses won't help him. I won't let him catch my stallion." With a laugh, Griegor saddled the old mare, and to avoid meeting his father, rode out to the steppe through the threshing-floor gate. They rode to the field at the top of the hill. Close to a withered ash, horsemen were awaiting them. The officer Listnitsky, on a clean-limbed, handsome mare, and 7 of the village lads mounted bareback. "Where shall we start from?" The officer turned to Mitka, adjusting his pince-nez and admiring the stallion's powerful chest muscles. "From the ash to the Tsar's Lake." "Where is the Tsar's Lake?" Listnitsky screwed up his eyes short-sightedly. "There, Your Excellency, close to the forest." They lined up the horses. The officer raised his whip above his head. "When I say 3, all right? 1, 2, 3. Listnitsky got away first, pressing close to the saddle-bow, holding his cap on with his hand. For a second he led all the rest. Mitka, with face desperately pale, rose in his stirrups. To Griegor he seemed insufferably slow in bringing the whip down on the croup of his stallion. It was some 2 miles to the Tsar's Lake. Stretched into an arrow, Mitka's stallion caught up with Listnitsky's mare when half the course had been covered. Left behind from the very beginning, Griegor trotted along, watching the straggling chain of riders. By the Tsar's Lake was a sandy hillock, washed up through the ages. Its yellow camel hump was overgrown with sandwort. Griegor saw the officer and Mitka gallop up the hillock and disappear over the brow together, the others following. When he reached the lake, the horses were already standing in a group around Lisnitsky. Mitka was sleek with restrained delight. His every movement was expressive of triumph. Contrary to his expectation, the officer seemed not at all disconcerted. He stood with his back against a tree, smoking a cigarette, and said, pointing to his foam-flecked horse, "I've raced her 120 miles. I rode over from the station only yesterday. If she were fresh, you'd never overtake me, Korshunov." "Maybe," Mitka said magnanimously. Griegor and Mitka left the others and rode home around the hill. Listnitsky took a chilly leave of them, thrust 2 fingers under the peak of his cap, and turned away. As he was approaching the hut, Griegor saw Aksiniya coming towards him. She was stripping a twig as she walked. When she noticed him, she bent her head lower. Gazing straight before him, Griegor almost rode her down, then suddenly touched up the peacefully ambling mare with his whip. She sat back on her hind legs and sent a shower of mud over Aksiniya. "Oh, you stupid devil!" she exclaimed. Turning sharply and riding his excited horse at her, Griegor asked, "Why don't you pass the time of day? You're not worth it. And that's why I sent the mud over you. Don't hold your head so high." "Let me pass!" Aksiniya shouted, waving her arms in front of the horse's nose. "What are you trampling me with your horse for? She's a mare, not a horse. I don't care. Let me pass." "What are you getting angry for, Aksiniya? Surely not for the other day in the meadow." Griegor gazed into her eyes. Aksiniya tried to say something, but abruptly a little tear hung in the corner of her black eye. Her lips quivered pitifully. Shudderingly choking, she whispered, "Go away, Griegor. I'm not angry, And she went. The astonished Griegor overtook Mitka at the gate. "Coming out for the evening?" Mitka asked. "No." "Why, what's on? Or did she invite you to spend the night with her?" Griegor wiped his brow with his palm and made no reply. All that was left of Trinity in the village farms was the dry thyme scattered over the floors, the dust of crumpled leaves, and the shriveled, withered green of broken oak and ash branches fastened to the gates and stairs. The haymaking began immediately after Trinity. From early morning the meadow blossomed with women's holiday skirts, the bright embroidery of aprons and colored kerchiefs. The whole village turned out for the mowing. The mowers and rakers attired themselves as though for an annual holiday. So it had been from of old. From the dawn to the distant alder clumps, the ravaged meadowland stirred and pulsed. The Mielyakovs were late in starting. They set out when all but half the village were already in the meadow. "You sleep late, Panteleimon Prokofyevitch," the perspiring haymakers clamored. "Not my fault. The women again," the old man laughed, and urged on the bullocks with his knout of rawhide. At the back of the cart sat Aksiniya, her face completely wrapped up to protect it from the sun. From the narrow slits left for her eyes, she calmly and severely stared at Griegor seated opposite her. Darya, also wrapped up and dressed in her Sunday best, her legs hanging between the rungs of the wagon side, was giving her breast to the child dozing in her arms. Dunya danced alongside, her happy eyes scanning the meadow, and the people met along the road. Drawing the sleeve of his cotton shirt over his fists, Panteleimon wiped away the sweat running down from under the peak of his cap. His bent back, with the shirt stretched tightly across it, darkened with moist patches. The sun pierced slantingly through a gray scrawl of cloud and dropped a fan of misty, refracted rays over the meadow, the village, and the distant silvery hills of the dawn. The day was sultry. The little clouds crept along drowsily, not even overtaking Panteleimon's bullocks dragging along the road. The old man himself lifted and waved the knout heavily, as though in doubt whether to strike their bony flanks or not. Evidently realizing this, the bullocks did not hasten their pace, and slowly, gropingly set forward their cloven hoofs. A dusty gold and orange-tinged horsefly circled above them. "There's our strip," Panteleimon waved his knout. Griegor unharnessed the weary bullocks. His earring glittering, the old man went to look for the mark he had made at the end of the strip. "Bring the scythes," he called out after a moment, waving his hand. Gregor went to him, treading down the grass and leaving an undulating track behind him.